The first sign was the cradles. They came down the west corridor at dawn, 6 of them, carried in careful silence by carpenters who usually worked only at night. Their polished wood caught what little morning light reached the palace interior, and for a moment the whole passage looked less like the home of an immortal court and more like any ordinary household preparing for ordinary life. No one spoke to me as they passed. They didn't need to. In a palace ruled by a vampire king, cradles were not just furniture. They were a question. I stood with my ledger pressed against my chest and felt the familiar small trouble of my day tighten into something larger. My ink had frozen again in my room overnight. The thin glass bottle cracked along its neck, and I'd spent half an hour warming what remained between my palms, trying not to think about how quickly my hands had started to ache in cold these past winters. The palace kept its own weather, cool, dry, endlessly dusk-toned, and I was a human body living inside it. There were mornings I woke up and had to remind myself to breathe as if breathing mattered here. Then 6 cradles went by as if the palace had suddenly remembered that breathing did matter. By midday, whispers had multiplied like moths around lamps. The vampire king's lover, gone for years, spoken of only in careful, reverent half-sentences, had returned to the realm's borders. Not alone. With children. 6, they said. 6 after years apart. 6 that no one expected, because no one dared expect anything tender from a court built on patience and restraint. I tried to tell myself it was none of my concern. I was only Elin, a minor archivist with soft hands and a soft voice, hired because I could read old human scripts without flinching at the mold. My work was quiet, sorting brittle letters, copying fading maps, recording names that belonged to people dead for centuries. If I did my task well, I was allowed to stay. If I did it poorly, I would be dismissed with a courtesy that felt sharper than anger. Still, that evening, I found myself drifting toward the nursery wing, an unused set of rooms kept shut for as long as anyone remembered. The locks had been removed. Candles burned there now, steady and warm. Someone had opened the heavy curtains, letting in a spill of grey sky. At the threshold I stopped. Not because I was forbidden, but because my courage was sometimes like that, present, but delayed. I had lived in the palace for 3 years, and I still moved as if every floorboard might protest my weight. A familiar voice came from behind me. "If you stare much longer," said Myra the cook, "you'll turn to stone and I'll have to season you and serve you to the court." Myra was human too, older than me by decades and braver in a simple way. She always smelled of rosemary and flower, and she never lowered her eyes when a vampire passed. The first time I saw her do that, my chest hurt with admiration. "I didn't know," I said, which was a poor sentence but the truth. "I mean." I heard. Myra stepped beside me and looked into the newly lit rooms. No one knew. No one expected. Her voice softened on the last words. 6 children. Imagine. After all these years. "Do vampires even," I began, then stopped. It felt rude to finish. Myra didn't scold me. "Not often," she said. "And not like this. The lover was gone a long time, Elin. That kind of absence changes a palace more than a war ever could. Because war gives you something to do. Waiting gives you only yourself. Waiting. I knew something about that. Waiting for letters that didn't come. Waiting for the ache of homesickness to dull. Waiting for my own life to start again, as if it had been paused when I crossed the palace gates. Myra nudged my elbow. Go on. They'll need hands to fold linens and label drawers. Don't pretend you don't want to be useful. Useful. That was how I survived here, by making myself needed in a way that didn't threaten anyone. Inside the nursery wing, the air smelled of clean wood and melted wax. New linens sat in stacks, white as untouched snow. Small shirts hung on a line near the hearth. Someone had placed 6 little night lamps on a shelf, each shaped like a different flower. On a table lay a list written in the steady hand of Lord Sirene, the steward, vampire, ancient, courteous. At the top, prepare for the arrival of the royal wards. Wards, not heirs. That word mattered. It meant protection, responsibility, and, perhaps, choice. At the bottom of the list was a note that tightened my throat. Archive assistance requested. Items to be catalogued, toys, books, gifts sent from allied houses. That was for me. The next days filled with small tasks that were not mine and yet became mine. I carried boxes of gifts into the archive room usually reserved for sealed documents. I dusted toys that looked too bright for these halls, a painted horse, a set of wooden blocks carved with constellations, a rag doll with button eyes. I opened a crate of children's books written in 4 languages and felt something in me soften, like a fist unclenching. When I was little, my father used to read to me by a window that caught late afternoon sun. I could still hear his voice if I tried, though the memory brought grief with it, the kind of grief that sits quietly, like a stone in a pocket. My father had died before I ever came here. So had my younger brother. There were days I thought I had come to the palace because I was already practiced in living among absences. I catalogued each gift carefully, but I found myself doing more than recording. On scraps of paper, I wrote brief notes and tied them to the items with thin ribbon. This horse is meant to gallop. It will not break if you drop it. These blocks can become a tower, or a bridge, or a home. This book is about a girl who gets lost and finds her way back by listening to birds. I told myself I was only helping the nurses know what belonged where. But the truth was simpler. I wanted the children, whoever they were, to enter this palace and feel something human waiting for them, something that said, "You are not an inconvenience. You are not a rumor. You are welcome." On the 4th night, while I was still tying notes, Lord Sirene appeared at the archive door. He moved the way vampires did here, not with menace, but with an economy that made my own movements feel clumsy. "Archivist Elin," he said. His voice was gentle, almost tired. "You have been diligent." I straightened, suddenly aware of ink on my cuff. "I can redo the labels if they are not appropriate, my lord." "They are appropriate," he said. He glanced at the toys, at the books, at my ribbon notes. His eyes lingered long enough that I wondered if he could read what I had written without touching. Then he said, "The children will arrive tomorrow before dusk. The household will be watchful." Watchful. That word carried caution without threat. He continued, "The royal family will require someone in the nursery wing during daylight hours. Someone who can read. Someone warm." He paused, as if selecting a word that would not insult his own kind. "You are asked to serve, if you choose. If you choose." I had not heard that phrase often inside these walls. My mouth was dry. "Yes," I said. Then, because I needed to keep my dignity intact by speaking as if I had options, I added, "If my archive duties allow it." Lord Sirene inclined his head. "They will." After he left, I sat down among the boxes and pressed my palm to the lid of the crate of books. My heart beat too fast, not with fear exactly, but with the sharp awareness that my life was about to change in a way I hadn't planned. I slept poorly. I dreamed of cradles lined up like boats at a shore. The next evening, the palace quieted as if it were holding its breath. From a tall window near the nursery corridor, I watched the arrival. There were no trumpets. Only a line of carriages moving through the courtyard in soft twilight, wheels whispering on stone. Servants stood in respectful rows. The air smelled of wet leaves, a light rain had fallen earlier. The Vampire King stepped out first. He was taller than any man I'd known, his presence so composed it seemed carved. He did not look toward the windows. His gaze was fixed ahead, as if the world might shift if he blinked. Then his lover appeared, wrapped in a cloak the color of midnight water. I could not tell their age, vampires wore years like a well-kept secret, but there was something about the way they paused on the carriage step, scanning the courtyard, that reminded me of a parent arriving late and hoping the door hasn't already been closed. And then the children came down. 6. They were not all the same. One was old enough to walk with practiced calm, holding a small satchel tight against their side. Another was little, carried on a hip, cheek pressed to the lover's shoulder. Two moved close together like twins though their faces were different, one with pale hair, one with dark curls. A fifth trailed slightly behind, eyes wide, taking in the palace with the solemn concentration of someone trying not to cry. The sixth, the smallest, had a knitted cap pulled low and hands fisted in the fabric of a blanket. They were quiet. Not frightened, exactly, but braced. No one bowed deeply, not in the old theatrical way. The court simply lowered their heads, a gesture that felt almost humble. I realized then that the palace was not only watchful, it was uncertain. 6 children made uncertainty unavoidable. Children asked questions without meaning to. They noticed what adults worked hard to hide. I left the window before anyone could catch me staring. When the nursery doors opened later, I stood inside with Myra and 2 nurses I barely knew. The lamps were lit. The hearth was warm. A pot of broth simmered, Myra's doing, no doubt, because Myra believed even immortals should eat something comforting when life turns strange. The lover entered first, with the children gathered around like small moons. They looked tired. Travel tired, life tired, the particular tiredness of having been told to be brave for too long. I stepped forward, and for a moment my courage wavered. What did I have to offer them? A human voice in a vampire palace. A few labeled toys. Stories written on scraps of paper. Then I remembered my own first night here, how I had clutched my bag and tried not to show that my hands shook. No one had been cruel. But no one had been warm either. I had survived by shrinking myself into usefulness. I would not ask children to survive that way. I lowered myself to their height and spoke softly. Hello? I'm Elin. I keep the books and the quiet things. This room is yours. The oldest child studied me with a suspicion too mature for their face. Are you one of them? They asked, not accusing, simply needing to know. I'm human, I said. Like the cook. That seemed to help. Their shoulders dropped a fraction, as if something tight inside them had loosened. The youngest, still clinging to the blanket, stared at the flower-shaped lamps. Do they burn? They whispered. They are safe, I said. They are meant to make the dark less lonely. The lover watched me for a brief moment, eyes unreadable, then guided the children farther in. The Vampire King remained in the doorway like a shadow that had chosen to become a person. He did not enter. He did not speak. He simply looked at the 6 small forms in the warm room, and for an instant his composure wavered, not dramatically, just enough that I saw what lay beneath it, an immense caution, as if he were afraid to breathe too hard and scatter them. Then he was gone, leaving the room quieter, not with loss but with relief. The first week was made of ordinary moments that felt like miracles only because I had forgotten how much ordinary moments could matter. I learned which child liked broth and which refused it until Myra offered bread on the side. I learned that one woke at every small sound, sitting bolt upright as if expecting to be moved again. I learned that 2 of them argued over nothing just to prove they had a voice. I learned that the oldest child, and, they finally told me, could read already, but pretended not to until they were sure no one would use it against them. In the palace, kindness was rarely announced. It appeared as routine. A cup placed within reach. A blanket folded at the foot of a bed. A door left slightly open. So I made routines. Each morning, I opened the curtains as far as the grey sky allowed. Light doesn't have to be bright to be real, I told them, though perhaps I was also telling myself. Each afternoon, we went to the indoor garden where night-blooming lilies grew in shallow pools. The children crouched by the water and watched their reflections ripple. Some days they laughed. Other days they only watched, as if learning what their own faces looked like in a place that did not use mirrors. Each evening, I read aloud. I chose stories without heroes who conquered anyone. Stories where people found their way home, or made homes where none existed, or forgave themselves for being small. One night, Elin asked me, very quietly, "Do humans die fast?" The question landed in my chest like a cold pebble. Yes, I said, because lying would have been a kind of disrespect. Compared to them, yes. Elin's eyes flickered toward the hallway, where the palace always seemed to listen. Doesn't that make you scared? I thought of my brother's short life, of my father's absent voice, of the way I had arrived here believing I could outlast grief by placing myself somewhere timeless. I'm scared sometimes, I admitted. But it also makes me careful. It makes me pay attention. When you know you have fewer days, you learn to hold them gently. Elin considered that, then nodded once, as if filing it away for later. Children did that, collected truths the way I collected documents. Not everything was smooth. On the 8th day, I overheard 2 court attendants speaking in a side corridor. Their voices were low, but stone carries sound. "The human is too close," one said. "They'll imprint. It will be harder when she's gone." "Humans are temporary," the other replied, not unkindly, simply stating it like weather. I stood with my hands full of folded linens and felt something sharp rise in me, not rage, but a sudden, fierce insistence. They were right. I was temporary. That fact had haunted me since the day I entered the gates. But it did not mean I was disposable, and it did not mean the love I gave would be a mistake. I carried the linens to the nursery, laid them down, then went straight to the steward's office. My knees shook the entire walk. Courage, I discovered, was not the absence of shaking. It was walking anyway. Lord Sirene looked up when I entered. "Elin, I want to remain assigned to the nursery wing," I said. My voice trembled only slightly. If the household worries about attachment, then let it worry. The children have had enough careful distance. They need someone who will stay through the day and not treat them like fragile objects. Lord Sirene studied me with those old, quiet eyes. You speak boldly. I speak truthfully, I said, and surprised myself by lifting my chin. If I must leave one day, then I will leave. But I won't rehearse my leaving while I'm still here. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for a parchment, wrote a few lines, and pressed his seal into the wax. Your assignment stands, he said. Annalie, the court is learning. Slowly. I took the sealed parchment with hands that had stopped shaking. When I left his office, the corridors looked the same as always, stone, candlelight, tapestries that never faded, but I felt different inside them. Less like a guest trying not to offend. More like a person who had chosen her place. The quiet climax of that season came, not with any grand decree, but with a fever. The smallest child, Lark, grew hot and listless one afternoon, cheeks flushed, eyes half-lidded. The palace healers arrived with their clean vials and cool hands, speaking in calm tones that did not comfort a child who wanted warmth. They offered tonics that smelled of metal and night herbs. Myra pulled me aside. It's a human fever, she murmured. Travel and cold rooms. He needs something simple. But they won't, I began. Myra's gaze was steady. Then you will. So I did. I went to the kitchens, found dried elderflower and honey, and brewed tea the way my mother used to when my brother's breath came too fast. I warmed a brick by the hearth and wrapped it in cloth to place near Lark's feet. I sang softly, not a lullaby I remembered perfectly, just a thread of melody my voice could hold. When the lover entered and saw me there, kneeling by the bed with a cup in my hands, I expected reprimand. Instead, they watched for a long time, eyes shining with something like fatigue and gratitude tangled together. You didn't have to, they said. I wanted to, I replied. My throat tightened. Children shouldn't have to be brave all the time. The lover nodded once, as if that sentence had been the reason they returned at all. Lark's fever broke before dawn. By morning he asked for bread, then for his flower lamp, then, softly, if I would read the story about the lost girl again. I read it, my voice calm though my hands still shook from relief. Weeks passed. The nursery wing filled with small signs of life, a scarf left on a chair, a book abandoned open on the rug, tiny shoes lined up with solemn care. The palace did not become bright, not truly. It remained a place of moonlit halls and quiet rules. But it grew warmer in a way I had not known it could. One evening near the first snow, the children and I stood in the indoor garden, watching frost gather on the edges of lily leaves. Anne held a book under one arm. Lark leaned against my side, heavy with sleep. From across the garden walkway, the vampire king passed, silent, distant, his gaze briefly touching the group as if counting to reassure himself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He paused. Not long enough to turn this into a scene, only long enough to acknowledge what he saw. His eyes met mine. There was no intimacy in it, no romance, no dramatic understanding. Only recognition, like a nod between two people who had both chosen restraint and found, unexpectedly, that tenderness could live inside it. Then he moved on, his presence fading into the palace's usual hush. Anne watched him go and whispered, "Do you think he's happy?" I considered the question carefully. "I think," I said, "he's trying." Anne's expression softened, and in that small shift I saw a child allowing the world to be complicated without being cruel. Later that night, after the children were asleep, I sat alone at the nursery table and looked at the ribbons on the toys, the notes in my own handwriting. I thought of how I had once believed survival meant staying unnoticed. How I had tried to make myself small enough to fit between immortal stone walls without leaving a mark. Yet here I was, leaving marks everywhere, soft ones, the kind that could be cleaned away and still matter. A routine. A story. A cup of tea. A petition written with shaking hands and steady intention. No one had expected 6 children in a vampire palace. No one had expected the king's lover to return after years apart, carrying not a threat but a fragile hope. And I, least expected of all, had not expected myself to become someone who could stand in the middle of that hope and not apologize for being human. Outside, snow began to fall, soundless against the windows. Inside, 6 small breaths rose and fell in the warm room, and my own breath joined them, quiet, real, unafraid. I did not know how long I would remain here. I was still temporary. But I had stopped measuring my worth by duration. Some lives are brief and still complete. That night, as I extinguished the lamps one by one, I felt a simple kind of peace settle into me, dignity not granted by any king, but earned in the daily choice to be gentle, to be brave in small ways, and to stay present in a place that had forgotten, until now, what presence could mean.